There's a strange pattern in the salon industry. Some salons always feel like they're chasing bookings, chasing retail sales, they're, chasing their team to stay consistent. They're chasing the next promotion just to keep the numbers moving. And the exhausting part is most saloners think, hey, it's just normal. They assume that's just the business. But then you see another salon, same city, same economy, the same services, and somehow their guests say yes more often. Retail numbers are higher, their team sounds more confident, and their revenue grows almost predictably. So, what's the difference? Do they have better talent, better pricing, better marketing? Well, sometimes they do, but most of the time, the difference is much more simple than that. High revenue salons don't chase guests, they design decisions. And once you see how that works, you'll never look at your salon the same way again.
Yeah, before we go any further, we have to tell you something because we didn't always know this. And one of us learned it the hard way. There was a specific moment. It was an appointment. I remember it clearly. A guest I'd had for over a year. She trusted me completely. She told me at the start of the service that her hair felt like it was constantly breaking, and that she'd tried everything and she was frustrated. I knew exactly what was happening. I could see it. She had dehydrated ends, like her hair was compromised, and her at home routine was quietly undoing everything we were doing in the chair. And at the end of the service, she looked in the mirror and she smiled. And I said, "You look great. See you next time." And that was it. She left. And I stood there thinking, well, she seemed happy. I didn't want to push anything on her. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then. She went home that night, looked in the mirror, and 2 days later, her hair was doing the same thing again. And wasn't because I didn't care, but it was because I didn't say anything. I had the diagnosis, I had the solution, and I chose my own comfort, the comfort of not feeling like I was selling over her transformation. And that was the moment that I understood I wasn't failing at selling. I was failing at design. And that one shift changed everything.
I think about this, Lindsay, because inside most salons, the business model looks something like this, right? I can relate to everything you just said. A guest books a service, they arrive, the service happens, and at the end of the appointment, the professional might say something like, or, the stylist might say something like, hey, let me know if you like anything today. Or, hey, we do have some products over here if you're interested. Or, like, hey, the classic one is like, hey, your total is $148 today. And then everyone silently hopes that the guest says yes to something. Like they're crossing their fingers, hope they say yes. But here's the truth: hope is not a system. That's a writer downer. Hope is not a system. And high performing businesses rarely rely on hope. They truly rely on design because when decisions are designed, they default, or when decisions are not designed, they default to hesitation.
Yeah, think about the last time you walked into a truly exceptional experience. Maybe it was a boutique, or maybe it was a restaurant or a coffee shop. A couple come to mind for me right now. I recently just got a tire that was leaking air, and I went in to fill up with air on a Sunday, and there was a guy that happened to be there, and he's like, "Hey, do you want me to actually fix that for you?" And my poor dad would roll over if he knew that I didn't even occur to me that there was a slow leak in my tire and I was going to need to fix that problem, or it was going to continue to be an issue for me. And so, he fixed it on the spot. He wasn't even open, and I got to learn that I didn't even know that they burn tires to reseal the inside of them. Anyway, it was incredible. And Jen, I know you and I have shared so many great experiences at restaurants where, they've gotten our information and the whole experience was curated up to the follow-up call,
Mhm.
but uh, I notice something about interesting about these experiences, they guide you, like the menu highlights certain items at a restaurant. The environments make making decisions easier. Someone asked a thoughtful question at exactly the right moment. You didn't feel pressured, you felt taken care of. That's not an accident, that's design. And the most successful salons operate the exact same way.
Yeah, so let's picture two different salon experiences. In the first one, let's say a guest walks in thinking, did I get everything? Or they walk out thinking, did I get everything that I came for today? And they say, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll Google it, or you know what? I'll ask ChatGPT later. This actually just happened inside our salon. Somebody came, got a toner, didn't like the toner, went home and ChatGPT, how do I remove a toner? Did whatever Chat said, and then called back and said, I ChatGPT how to remove a toner. Now my hair is orange. So like, they really, people do that. So
Mhm.
and because in that moment, I guess was uncertain. She was guessing. Maybe should use ChatGPT, but maybe that guest that leaves not feeling like they got what they wanted, they then go buy something on Amazon or from another competitor right down the street. And the second experience, let's say a guest walks out thinking, wow, I feel amazing. And I know exactly what I'm doing when I get home. You see, in that moment, confidence replaced that uncertainty, that clarity replaced guessing, and clarity changes decisions.
So relatable, Jen. Let's actually talk about the word design. Design simply means to create something intentionally, not randomly or reactively, but intentionally. So when a salon designs decisions, they don't leave the guest experience up to chance. They structure key moments on purpose. Moments like the consultation, the diagnosis, the recommendation, the finishing touch, the checkout conversation, the follow up. Each of those moments either creates clarity or confusion, and clarity leads to decisions. Let's actually look at the word chase. The word chase actually comes from a hunting term. It means pursuing something that is already running away. Think about that. When you chase something, it means it's already moving away from you.
Yeah, that's like a police chase,
Yeah.
because like truly, like chasing guests shows up really in three very common ways inside salons. Of course, the first one is discounting. So when sales feel inconsistent, like salons will run promotions. Oh my gosh, we're low this week. Hey guys, we're gonna do a 20% off this week. Retail
Mhm.
sale, buy one, get one free. But here's what most salon owners never stop to calculate is if you're discounting just two services a week to fill gaps, even at 20% off a $150 service, that's $3,120 a year. Wow. So like that $3,120 a year you handed back to guests who would have paid full price if you designed the moment differently. And that's a conservative number. You're like, Jen, that's not even that much money. But for many salons, it's two or three times that because discounts don't solve confusion. They just lower the price of uncertainty. And they slightly train your guests that your value is negotiable and train you that charging full price takes bravery. And the second thing that we like to look at when it comes to chasing guests is sometimes professionals recommend products and sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes they mention treatments, sometimes they skip it entirely. Oh my gosh, I'm running behind. I just got to get this done, right? There's no consistent structure, and inconsistency creates hesitation in the guest and in the professional. And then the third way that chasing shows up when it comes to guests is many salons wait until checkout to mention solutions. It's the end of service selling. So, but by then, when they do that, the guest has mentally completed the experience. They're ready to go on and do what they got to do for the day. So the decision window has already closed, and the recommendation feels sudden instead of helpful.
Mm. Yeah. We need to say something here that might actually be uncomfortable because it was uncomfortable for us when we first really understood it. When you see a problem your guest doesn't fully see yet and you say nothing, you are not being humble. You are not being considerate. You are not protecting them from feeling sold to. You are choosing your own comfort over their transformation. Think about that. Your guest came to you because they trust you. They are sitting in your chair with a problem they've been living with, sometimes for years. And you have the diagnosis, you have the solution. You can see exactly what's happening and how to fix it. And if you stay silent, they go home with the same problem. Not because you didn't know, but because saying something felt uncomfortable for you. That's not humility. That's selfishness dressed up as kindness. Designing decisions isn't about revenue. It's about serving people at the highest level you are capable of. And when you understand that, really understand that, silence stops feeling safe and starts feeling like a failure to serve.
I love that. So here's what this looks like in real numbers. We've watched salons inside our community shift just one moment in the guest experience, just one moment, not an overhaul, not a new hire, not a rebrand, and see their retail per visit move from $8 to $34 within 60 days. Not because they became better at sales, because they designed one decision point differently. And that one change came across, I think there was a team of 5 service
Mhm.
providers seeing was it 6 guests a day. I think it was
Mhm.
5 days a week, and, when I did the math, that was the difference between $62,400 and $265,200 a year in retail alone. What? That's triple, right? Close enough. And so this or maybe quadruple. Is it
Yeah, it
quadruple?
was.
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
quadruple, yeah. The same talent, the same guest, the same salon, just a completely different design.
Yeah. So how you might be thinking, how does a salon actually do this? How do you go from chasing to designing? And that's exactly what we built the grade framework for. Grade is the system we teach every beauty pro inside a salon business school. It's the step structure, for moving a guest from confusion to clarity. From the moment they sit down to the moment they walk out, knowing exactly what they need and why. It's not a sales script, it's a communication system. And when your entire team uses it consistently, the guest experience stops feeling like a series of individual interactions and starts feeling like a designed journey. Jen, I know you just recently had a guest come in who felt like their hair was dull.
Mhm.
And do you remember
Yeah,
that?
yes, yes, her face is in my head right now. Yeah, she said her hair was dull, and so, a service provider had worked with her and then needed some help with checkout. And so I saw her just browsing some products. And she wasn't quite certain because we missed maybe a couple viewpoints of exactly what to prescribe to her. And so we truly just went over the grade framework, which is get curious, asking them what's most important, repeat back what they heard, ask some more questions to to collect data because we know data equals dollars. And then we diagnosed, and then we enrolled her. And like when we went through that, it's like her whole entire life had been changed. She now had the tools that her hair was no longer going to feel dull. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to tell all my friends about this place. But that's because we used a system to get her that result.
Yeah, so good. And that guest isn't being sold, they're being guided through a decision. And guided people don't hesitate. They say yes because the decision finally makes sense.
And this is where truly, Lindsay, if you think about it, this is where identity becomes powerful. Service
Mhm.
providers perform services, but beauty pros, they guide outcomes. Service providers wait for guests to decide. Beauty pros help guests understand their options. And service providers, they hope that guests say yes, but beauty pros design the clarity that makes yes feel obvious. And when that identity spreads across your entire team, when every person in your salon understands that their job is not to just do the service, but to guide the outcome, everything changes.
Yeah, and this is also where salon owners step into a different role entirely. Service provider owners hope their team figures this out. But true salon owners design the experience intentionally. They build systems, they coach conversations, they structure moments of clarity because they understand something that took most of us years to learn. Revenue doesn't grow from chasing harder. Revenue grows from designing better.
Yeah, and this is truly why these conversations matter so much in the beauty industry right now, because the future of this profession is not just technical excellence, it's truly leadership. And it's professionals who understand psychology, they understand communication and transformation, and salons that design experiences instead of reacting to them. And when salons begin thinking this way, everything shifts. Guests feel more confident, the teams feel more empowered, and the revenue becomes more predictable, and the entire profession rises.
Yeah. So if your salon ever feels like it's constantly chasing guests, sales, the next promotion, pause and ask a different question. Not how do we sell more, but where in our guest experience are decisions unclear? Because the salons that grow most consistently are not the ones that chase harder. They're the ones that design better. They design clarity, they design confidence, and ultimately they design decisions. Imagine walking into your salon on a Monday morning knowing before a single guest sits down that your team already understands what to say, when to say it, and why it matters. You know, that the consultation isn't just improvised, that the recommendation isn't optional, that the guest journey has been designed from the moment they book to the moment they walk out the door. That's not a dream. That's what a designed salon feels like, and it's completely buildable. If the grade framework we talked about today is something you want your entire team using, that's exactly what we teach inside $1 Million Beauty Pro and Salon Business School. This is the system, and the doors are open. We'll see you on the next episode.